In January 1736, a ship traveling across the Atlantic from England to Georgia encountered a severe storm. The ship was carrying a young missionary preacher. You may have already guessed his name. If not, it was John Wesley. Wesley was on his way to the American colonies with high hopes for fruitful ministry among the colonists and perhaps among the native peoples as well. And then they ran into a storm. The storm raged for hours, on and on and on. And as the thunder roared and the rain punished the Simmons, young John Wesley found himself with some of the deepest fear he'd ever experienced in his life. Here he is in his own words. The winds roared about us. The ship not only rocked to and fro with the utmost violence, but shook and jarred with so unequal, grating emotion that one could not, but with great difficulty, keep one's hold of anything, nor stand a moment without it. Every 10 minutes came a shock against the stern or the side of the ship, which one would think would dash the planks in pieces. Also on the ship was a group of German Moravian Christians. Their posture in the middle of the storm was quite different than Wesley's, and he was struck and changed irreversibly by their testimony. When he heard through the deafening thunder and the roaring wind the sound of singing, these German Christians were singing hymns and psalms while the ship was torn stem to stern. Wesley was so struck, I want you again to hear him in his own words. This is what he wrote in his journal after the fact. In the midst of the psalm wherewith their service began. So just get this in your heads. The ship is about to sink. They're having church. In the midst of the psalm wherewith their service began, the sea broke over, split the mainsail in pieces, covered the ship, and poured in between the decks, as if the great deep had already swallowed us up. A terrible screaming began among the English. The Germans calmly sang on. I asked one of them afterwards, "Was not you afraid?" He answered, "I thank God, no." I asked, get this, "But were not your women and children afraid?" He replied mildly, "No, our women and children are not afraid to die." John Wesley was afraid to die. That moment, those hours, produced in him a fear that ran deeper than he would have previously imagined. He was afraid to die because he was afraid to stand before God. He was afraid to die because he was unsure of his faith. And he feared that if he stood before God, he would stand condemned. Now remember who we're talking about here. He's already an ordained minister. The guy's been a pastor for a while now. Not only that, he's a missionary. He's on a boat going to another land to do gospel work. Before that, he had spent, and at this point in his life, he would literally spend hours and hours a day praying and reading his Bible in Hebrew and Greek. Wesley expected the people who were a part of his group to get up way before the sun came up for prayer and Bible reading. Hours a day is not an overstatement. Not only were they deeply committed to their own private devotion, they were deeply involved in caring for the poor and the imprisoned. They visited people in prison. They worked to feed the hungry. They worked to clothe the naked. He did all the right stuff. He'd been to seminary, or their version of seminary in the 18th century. He'd had theological training. A bishop had laid his hands on Wesley and given him authority to preach the gospel. He did all the right stuff that a good Christian's supposed to do and more. And yet, when he faced the possibility, the very real possibility of his death, he felt not the assurance of God's perfect love, but fear. Deep fear. Up until this point in his life, and even afterwards for some time, Wesley had spent himself relying on his own resolve to curry favor with God. He had committed himself to discipline, to prove his worth to the Almighty. And now he finds that all his efforts had failed him, and miserably so. As he strove for a reward from God based on his own moral rectitude. But that night, on that ship, he came face to face with the reality that he could not attain what he wanted most if he went after it in his own strength. He could never do enough to assure himself that God loved him. He couldn't perform at a high enough level. He couldn't pray enough hours. He couldn't read enough pages in the scriptures to gain that assurance of God's love. And there, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, his life under threat, he found himself, though he didn't know it at the time, on a journey. It was a journey of discovery. And the thing that he would discover is the thing I want us to hold on to. It's that the assurance of God's love is a gift to receive, not a reward to obtain. The gift of God's love is always, 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 always pure gift that we receive, and never a negotiation, never a striving, never a, I've got to prove myself to you so that you'll give me your favor. We may think, who would even think like that? Well, Wesley did, for starters. And he's not the only one. History is full of more people than we could count who have assumed that we relate to God with kind of a give and take. When Paul wrote to the Romans, he was writing in a culture where everyone basically thought if you play your cards with the gods, they'll favor you. Make your offerings, make your sacrifices. If you do it right, and they wake up on the right side of the bed, you'll get sun and rain for your crops in right proportion. And if you don't, well, you must have done something wrong. And it's got to be somebody's fault. And there are places around the world, some of you have been to them, where it's just like that. It's just like that. Now, in the church, it's more subtle, but it's still basically like that. I've served on the committees. I've worshiped regularly. I've gone to the soup kitchens. I've been on the mission trip. Why don't I feel God's assurance? It doesn't take long pastoring a church to meet plenty of folks who've been around a long time who are still afraid that God is waiting around the corner, just waiting for them to mess up so that he can. And we've got to negotiate. We've got to walk on eggshells. We got to do what he wants so he's nice to us and gives us stuff. I really think it's pretty much a universal human temptation to assume God is basically like that. We learn differently in Scripture. And you heard one of the students say on the video just a little while ago, the only place where you find anything different is here in this book. Everywhere else in the world, it's I've got to negotiate with God to obtain some sort of reward. And if that's our posture, if that's the way we come at it, even if we're very subtle, we're not going to be in a place where we can receive the gift of the assurance of his love. So let's go to Romans, because Romans chapter 8 is a place where this just explodes out all over the place, where we learn about our fundamental inability to please God and about his abounding love desiring to flood us with fatherly affection. If you want to understand Romans 8, you've got to wrap your mind around and kind of spend some time sitting with this contrast between spirit and flesh. You heard that language, right? The flesh on the one hand, the spirit on the other. Now, it's got to be really clear about some things. For Paul, flesh is not your skin. We talk about it sometimes like, got a gash in my flesh. I got to go to the emergency room and get stitched up or something like that, right? But for Paul, flesh is not your physicality. It's not your physical body. It's something else. It's a principle or an orientation. Maybe that's the right word. It's an orientation that says I'm basically focused on me, and I'm going to call the shots in my life, and I'm not really interested in having anyone else be Lord in my life. I'm in charge. It's this inward, Martin Luther called it this inward curvature of the heart that represents our sinful orientation. Charles Wesley called it a bent towards sinning. Same idea. I'm bent over and I need to be straightened out, or I'm curved in on myself and I need to be oriented towards God and neighbor. So the flesh is not like my body. The flesh is this principle, this spiritual principle or power that I collude with and that works on me. It makes me a slave and produces all kinds of evil stuff. And for Paul, that is the natural, that's the way people come into the world. Like from the start, we come into the world in the flesh, slaves to sin. Like we don't have the option to not do it. As cute as newborn babies are, and as much as we love them and just want to coo and cuddle with them and all the lovey-dovey baby stuff, we don't have to teach them to lie. You don't teach your kids to lie, right? They just do that normal, like that. They just do it, don't they? It just happens because it's in there. And when they get in trouble, he did it. We naturally throw somebody else under the bus to save our own skin, don't we? That thing is what Paul means when he talks about the flesh.